the shadows of Blackthorn Penitentiary. In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, nestled deep within a dense forest, stood Blackthorn Penitentiary. Built in the late 1800s, the prison was a relic of a bygone era, its stone walls weathered by time and its iron bars rusted with neglect. It was a place where the worst of society were sent to rot, murderers, rapists, and traitors. But it wasn't just the inmates who feared Blackthorn. The guards whispered of strange occurrences, of shadows that moved on their own, and of a curse that hung over the prison like a dark cloud. The story begins with a new guard, Daniel Carter, who had just transferred to Blackthorn from a minimum security facility. Daniel was a young man, eager to prove himself, but he had no idea what he was walking into. On his first day, he was given a tour by an older guard named Frank, a grizzled veteran who had worked at Blackthorn for over 2 decades. "You'll want to stay out of the East Wing," Frank warned as they walked through the dimly lit corridors. "That's where they keep the worst of the worst. And whatever you do, don't go down to the basement. That place. It's not right." Daniel laughed nervously. "What's down there? Ghosts?" Frank's face remained stern. "You'll see soon enough." The first few weeks were uneventful. Daniel settled into his routine, patrolling the halls and breaking up the occasional fight. But as time went on, he began to notice strange things. The temperature would drop suddenly, even in the middle of summer. He would hear whispers when no one was around, and sometimes out of the corner of his eye, he would see shadows moving where there should have been none. One night, during his shift, the power went out. The prison was plunged into darkness, and the emergency lights flickered weakly. Daniel was patrolling the East Wing when he heard a sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the walls themselves. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. "Is someone there?" There was no response, but the growling grew louder. Daniel fumbled for his flashlight and turned it on, sweeping the beam across the corridor. The light caught something, a figure standing at the end of the hall. It was tall and emaciated, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to run, but his legs refused to move. The figure began to shuffle toward him, its movements jerky and unnatural. As it drew closer, Daniel could see that its fingers ended in long, jagged claws. "Frank!" Daniel screamed, finally finding his voice. "Frank, help me!" But no one came. The figure was only a few feet away now, and Daniel could smell the stench of decay emanating from it. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for the end. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The power came back on, and the corridor was empty. Daniel collapsed to the floor, his body shaking with fear. The next day, he confronted Frank. "What the hell was that thing?" he demanded. Frank sighed and lit a cigarette. "I told you not to go down to the basement." "I didn't go to the basement," Daniel shouted. "It was right here in the East Wing." Frank's eyes narrowed. "That's impossible. The East Wing is bad enough, but the basement, that's where they keep the real monsters." Daniel's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Frank took a long drag from his cigarette before answering. Back in the 1920s, the warden at the time was a sadistic bastard. He used to perform experiments on the inmates, torture, mutilation, you name it. But he wasn't just interested in physical pain. He wanted to break their minds to see if he could turn them into something else. And he succeeded. The things he created, they're still down there, locked away in the darkest corners of the basement. But sometimes they get out. Daniel stared at Frank in disbelief. "You're telling me there are monsters in the basement?" Frank nodded. "And worse, the warden didn't just create monsters. He opened a door to something that shouldn't exist. And now it's feeding on the souls of everyone in this prison. That's why the inmates are so violent, why the guards are so paranoid. It's feeding on their fear, their anger, their despair." Daniel shook his head. "This is insane. I don't believe you." Frank shrugged. "You don't have to, but if you value your life, you'll stay out of the basement." For a while, Daniel tried to convince himself that Frank was just messing with him. But the strange occurrences continued. He would hear footsteps behind him when no one was there. He would see faces in the shadows, their eyes glowing with malice. And every night, he would dream of the basement, of something calling to him, beckoning him to come closer. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He had to know the truth. Late one night, when the prison was quiet, he made his way to the basement. The door was old and rusted, the lock barely holding. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The walls were lined with cells, their doors sealed shut. But as Daniel walked deeper into the basement, he noticed something strange. The cells were empty. There were no inmates, no monsters, just silence. And then he heard it, a low, guttural growl, just like the one he had heard in the East Wing. He turned around, and there it was, the same figure he had seen before. But this time, it wasn't alone. There were others, dozens of them, their eyes glowing in the darkness. Daniel tried to run, but the door slammed shut behind him. The figures closed in, their claws reaching for him. He screamed, but no one could hear him. The last thing he saw was the grotesque grin on the figure's face as it leaned in close. The next morning, Daniel was gone. The other guards searched the prison, but there was no sign of him. Frank knew the truth, but he didn't say a word. He just lit another cigarette and went back to work. Because at Blackthorn Penitentiary, some things were better left unsaid. The curse of Blackthorn. After Daniel's disappearance, the atmosphere in Blackthorn Penitentiary grew even darker. The guards avoided the East Wing and the basement at all costs, and the inmates became more restless than ever. Whispers of Daniel's fate spread through the prison like wildfire, and soon, even the most hardened criminals refused to speak of what might lurk in the shadows. Frank, the veteran guard, found himself haunted by guilt. He had warned Daniel, but he hadn't done enough to stop him. Night after night, he lay awake, listening to the distant sounds of growling and scratching that seemed to echo through the prison walls. He knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to find out what had happened to Daniel, and what was really going on in Blackthorn. One evening, after his shift, Frank gathered a few supplies. A flashlight, a crowbar, and a small crucifix his mother had given him years ago. He made his way to the basement, his heart pounding with every step. The door creaked open, and the stench of decay hit him like a wall. He stepped inside, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The basement was even worse than he remembered. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the stone. The air was thick with the sound of whispers, though Frank couldn't make out the words. He moved cautiously, his eyes scanning the empty cells. And then he saw it, a trail of blood leading to a door at the far end of the basement. Frank followed the trail, his grip tightening on the crowbar. The door was old and rusted, just like the one to the basement, but it was sealed shut with heavy chains. He hesitated for a moment, then began to pry the chains loose. As the last chain fell to the ground, the door swung open with a loud creak. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. The walls were covered in more symbols, and in the center of the room was a stone altar. On the altar lay Daniel's body, his face frozen in a look of pure terror. But that wasn't the worst part. Surrounding the altar were the figures Frank had only glimpsed before, tall, emaciated creatures with glowing eyes and jagged claws. They turned to face him, their grotesque grins widening. Frank stumbled back, his mind racing. He had heard the stories, but he had never believed them, not really. Now, faced with the horrifying truth, he realized how wrong he had been. The creatures began to move toward him, their movements slow and deliberate. Frank raised the crucifix, hoping it would offer some protection, but the creatures only laughed, a sound that sent chills down his spine. "You shouldn't have come here," one of the creatures hissed, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. Frank backed away, his eyes darting around the room for an escape. He noticed a large book on the altar, its pages filled with the same symbols that covered the walls. He grabbed it, hoping it might contain some clue to defeating the creatures. But as soon as he touched it, the room began to shake, and the whispers grew louder. The creatures lunged at him, their claws slashing through the air. Frank swung the crowbar, but it passed right through them as if they were made of smoke. He realized then that they weren't entirely physical. They were something else, something born of the darkness that had been unleashed in Blackthorn so many years ago. Desperate, Frank opened the book and began to read the symbols aloud. He didn't know what they meant, but he hoped they would do something. The creatures hesitated, their glowing eyes narrowing. The room grew colder, and the whispers turned into screams. Frank continued to read, his voice growing louder and more confident. And then, with a deafening roar, the creatures vanished. The room fell silent, and the air grew still. Frank collapsed to the floor, his body trembling with exhaustion. He had done it, he had banished the creatures, at least for now. But as he looked down at the book in his hands, he realized the truth. The symbols weren't just a means of banishing the creatures, they were a warning. The curse of Blackthorn Penitentiary was far older and more powerful than he had ever imagined. The warden's experiments had only been the beginning. The prison had been built on ancient, cursed land, and the creatures were just one manifestation of the evil that lurked beneath. Frank knew he couldn't stay. He grabbed Daniel's body and carried it out of the basement, determined to give him a proper burial. But as he left the prison, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The shadows seemed to follow him, and the whispers lingered in his mind. He never returned to Blackthorn Penitentiary. He quit his job and moved far away, hoping to leave the horrors behind. But the curse of Blackthorn wasn't so easily escaped. To this day, Frank hears the whispers in his dreams, and he knows that one day, the creatures will come for him. As for Blackthorn, it remains standing, a grim reminder of the evil that men can unleash. The inmates still whisper of the shadows that move on their own, and the guards still avoid the east wing and the basement. But every now and then, a new guard arrives, eager to prove themselves. And when they do, the cycle begins anew. The warden's legacy. Frank's escape from Blackthorn Penitentiary did not bring him peace. The book he had taken from the basement became both a burden and a curse. Its pages were filled with ancient symbols and rituals, written in a language he could not understand. Yet, every night he dreamed of the prison, of the warden, the experiments, and the creatures that lurked in the shadows. He knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Frank began to research the history of Blackthorn. He traveled to libraries, archives, and even spoke to historians who specialized in the occult. What he discovered was a chilling tale of greed, madness, and unspeakable evil. Blackthorn Penitentiary had been built in 1876 by a wealthy industrialist named Elias Blackthorn. The land it stood on was remote and isolated, perfect for a prison. But what Frank learned was that the land had a dark history long before the prison was constructed. Local legends spoke of a Native American tribe that had once lived in the area. They had warned settlers of a cursed valley, a place where the veil between worlds was thin and where dark spirits roamed freely. The tribe had performed rituals to keep the spirits at bay, but when they were driven from their land, the rituals stopped and the curse was unleashed. Elias Blackthorn, a man obsessed with power and control, ignored the warnings. He built his prison on the cursed land, using the labor of inmates to construct its walls. But as the prison took shape, strange things began to happen. Workers reported hearing voices in the forest, and some disappeared without a trace. Elias dismissed these incidents as superstition, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. When the prison was completed, Elias appointed himself as the first warden. He was a cruel and sadistic man, and he saw the inmates as nothing more than animals to be controlled. But his cruelty soon took a darker turn. He became obsessed with the idea of breaking the human spirit, of stripping away a person's humanity and reducing them to their most primal state. He began conducting experiments on the inmates, subjecting them to unspeakable torture in the name of science. It was during these experiments that Elias discovered the true nature of the curse. The dark spirits that haunted the land were drawn to pain and suffering, and they began to manifest within the prison. Elias saw this as an opportunity. He believed that if he could harness the power of the spirits, he could achieve immortality. He began performing rituals, using the blood and souls of the inmates to summon the spirits and bind them to his will. But the spirits were not so easily controlled. They twisted Elias's experiments, turning his subjects into monstrous creatures. The same creatures that Frank had encountered in the basement. Elias's obsession consumed him, and he became a prisoner of his own making. The spirits fed on his fear and madness, and in the end, they claimed him as their own. After Elias's death, the prison fell into disrepair. The experiments were buried, and the basement was sealed off. But the curse remained, and the spirits continued to feed on the suffering of those who were sent to Blackthorn. The ritual of binding. Frank realized that the book he had taken from the basement was Elias Blackthorn's journal. It contained detailed accounts of the experiments, as well as the rituals he had used to summon the spirits. But it also contained something else, a ritual of binding, a way to seal the spirits away forever. Frank knew what he had to do. He couldn't let the curse continue to claim lives. He returned to Blackthorn Penitentiary, determined to perform the ritual and put an end to the evil once and for all. The prison was even more foreboding than he remembered. The walls seemed to close in around him, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. He made his way to the basement, the journal clutched tightly in his hands. The door was still open, just as he had left it, and the symbols on the walls seemed to glow in the dim light. Frank set up the ritual as described in the journal. He drew a circle on the floor using salt and placed candles at each of the cardinal points. He read the incantation aloud, his voice echoing through the empty basement. As he spoke, the temperature dropped, and the whispers returned, louder and more frantic than ever. The creatures appeared, their glowing eyes fixed on Frank. They moved toward him, but the circle held them at bay. Frank continued the ritual, his voice growing stronger. The creatures howled in rage, their forms flickering like shadows in the candlelight. And then, with a final word, the ritual was complete. The creatures vanished, and the basement fell silent. The curse had been broken. The aftermath. Frank left Blackthorn Penitentiary for the last time. The weight of the curse lifted from his shoulders. But he knew that the evil that had been unleashed could never truly be destroyed. The spirits were bound, but they were still there, waiting for someone foolish enough to summon them again. The prison was eventually closed, its walls crumbling into ruin. But even in its abandonment, the land remained cursed. Locals avoided the area, and those who ventured too close reported hearing whispers in the wind and seeing shadows moving among the trees. As for Frank, he spent the rest of his life trying to forget what he had seen. But the memories of Blackthorn Penitentiary haunted him until his dying day. And when he passed, the whispers followed him into the darkness. Story 2. The Hollow Prison. They called it Blackwood Penitentiary, a fortress of despair lost in the cold wilderness of Montana. It was built in 1896, a monument to justice that had long since decayed into something far darker. Legends whispered that no prisoner left Blackwood unchanged. Some never left at all. The prison officially shut down in 1998 due to structural concerns, but those who worked there knew better. Guards quit without explanation. Inmates spoke of voices in the dark, of shadows moving in empty cells. But the real reason Blackwood closed was buried under decades of secrecy. Now, in 2024, Blackwood was reopening. A private corporation had purchased the property, converting it into a maximum security facility. But some places should remain forgotten. And for the new inmates arriving at Blackwood, the past was waiting. Jacob Reeves didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in hard time, in survival, in the weight of the cuffs around his wrists as the prison transport bus rumbled down the snow-covered road. He'd done 10 years in Angola for armed robbery. Now, thanks to a clerical error, he was being transferred to Blackwood to finish the last 5. The other inmates were quiet, staring out at the dense pine forest surrounding the road. The prison came into view like something out of a nightmare. High stone walls covered in frost, watchtowers looming like sentinels of death. Even the sky above seemed darker here. The bus rolled through the gate. Armed guards in black uniforms stood at attention. The air was heavy, thick with something unseen. "Welcome to hell," muttered the inmate beside Jacob. As they were processed, Jacob noticed strange details. Cameras covered in dust, entire wings of the prison locked off, guards who never met their eyes. When he was led to his cell, Block D, cell 42, he saw something scratched into the concrete wall above his bed. "It sees you." The first night was the worst. Jacob lay on his cot, listening. The prison was too quiet. No distant shouts, no clanging of metal doors. Just silence. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, like wind slipping through cracks in the walls. But as the hours dragged on, they grew louder. Words formed in the darkness. "He's still here." Jacob sat up, heart pounding. He wasn't the only one who heard them. Across the hall, an inmate named DeAndre was wide-eyed, clutching his blanket like a lifeline. "You hear that?" Jacob whispered. DeAndre nodded, his face pale. "Man, this place ain't right." Footsteps echoed down the hall. Slow, deliberate. A guard making his rounds? No, the sound was different, heavier, wet like bare feet slapping against stone. Then Jacob saw it. A figure, tall and gaunt, moving past his cell. Skin pale as ash, mouth stretched open in a silent scream, and its eyes empty, black voids. Jacob scrambled back. The figure paused, and then, just as suddenly, it was gone. By morning, Jacob was convinced the figure he had seen was a trick of his exhausted mind. But then DeAndre didn't show up for breakfast. "Yo, what happened to the dude across from me?" Jacob asked one of the guards. The guard didn't even look up. "Transferred? To where?" No answer. At lunch, Jacob asked around, but no one knew anything. Other inmates whispered that people had been disappearing for weeks, that no one transferred out of Blackwood. They just vanished. That night, Jacob couldn't sleep. He kept staring at the wall above his cot, at those 3 words, "IT sees you." He wished he knew who had written them, and if they were still alive. The days blurred together. More prisoners vanished. Guards refused to acknowledge it. Then one night, a new sound echoed through Blackwood. A deep, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across concrete. Jacob pressed his ear to the cell bars, and then he heard it, a whisper right behind him. "Come see." Jacob spun around, heart hammering. His cell was empty, but the air felt wrong, thicker. Then the floor vibrated. A low, rumbling groan came from beneath the prison, like something waking up. Jacob wasn't the only one who felt it. Shouts erupted across the block, then screams. A cell door clanged open. A man stumbled out, eyes wide with terror. Something yanked him back into the darkness. The door slammed shut. Jacob swore and pressed against the bars. Then the floor beneath him shifted. No, not the floor. The whole prison. Something was moving under Blackwood. The next morning, tension hung thick over Block D. Nobody talked about the screams from the night before. Nobody asked where the missing inmate had gone. At breakfast, Jacob found himself sitting across from an older prisoner. Grizzled, scarred, eyes hollow with knowledge he didn't want to share. His name was Mason, and he had been in Blackwood longer than anyone. "You felt it, didn't you?" Mason muttered, poking at his food. Jacob hesitated. "Felt what?" Mason smirked. "The thing beneath us." Jacob's stomach twisted. "What the hell are you talking about?" Mason leaned in, voice low. "They built this place on something old, something wrong. It's alive and it's hungry." Jacob scoffed. "You sound like a crazy old man." Mason's eyes darkened. "Then why do the guards pretend they don't hear the screams? Why do inmates keep vanishing?" Jacob didn't have an answer. That night, Jacob lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The prison felt different, like the walls were breathing. Then, drip, a wet sound. Drip. Jacob sat up. Something dark spread across his ceiling, leaking from the cracks. A thick, black liquid. It dripped onto his blanket, reeking of rot. His breath hitched. He kicked the blanket away, but the stain kept growing. Then, from somewhere deep beneath Blackwood, came a sound. A moan. Long, low, hungry. Jacob wasn't crazy. Mason was right. Blackwood was alive, and it was waking up. Jacob barely slept. The next morning, he found Mason in the yard. "We need to get out of here," Jacob muttered. Mason laughed dryly. "You think it's that easy? Blackwood doesn't let people go." Jacob frowned. "Then why are you still here?" Mason's expression darkened. "Because I know the truth." He leaned in. "There's a way out. Underneath us." Jacob's pulse quickened. "The basement." Mason shook his head. "Deeper. There are tunnels beneath Blackwood. Older than the prison. Older than anything." Jacob's skepticism wavered. After everything he had seen, he believed Mason. "How do we get down there?" Mason exhaled. "There's a door in the abandoned wing. But if we go down there, we might not come back." Jacob clenched his fists. "We're not coming back if we stay either." That night, during lockdown, Jacob and Mason made their move. They slipped past the guards, weaving through the empty corridors. The deeper they went, the colder it became. Finally, they reached a rusted metal door. Mason hesitated. Last chance to turn back. Jacob shoved the door open. A stairwell yawned before them, spiraling into blackness. The air was damp, reeking of mold and something worse. Something dead. Jacob swallowed hard. "Let's go." They descended into the dark. The stairs ended in a vast underground chamber. The walls were lined with ancient symbols, carved into the stone. And in the center, pit. Jacob felt his stomach drop. The hole was massive, its edges crumbling. A pulse came from within it, like a heartbeat. Mason whispered, "This is it. This is where it feeds." Then, a sound. Wet, slithering movement. Jacob turned, heart pounding. Something was crawling out of the pit. Jacob froze. A shape slithered up from the darkness. Long, emaciated, its limbs too thin, its fingers stretching like claws. Its skin was gray, pulsing, shifting as if something writhed beneath it. Its face, Jacob's breath caught. It had no face, only a hollow, gaping hole where eyes and a mouth should be. The thing breathed, a deep, ragged inhale that rattled through the chamber. Mason grabbed Jacob's arm. "Run!" The thing lunged. Jacob and Mason bolted up the stairs, taking them two at a time. Behind them, the creature scrambled, its fingers scraping stone, its breath wet and wheezing. Halfway up, Jacob tripped. Mason hauled him up just as claws swiped at his ankle. They reached the door. Mason shoved it open. The prison was different. The walls moved, pulsing like veins. The lights flickered, casting long, shifting shadows. The air buzzed with whispers. Jacob gasped. "What the hell is happening?" Mason's face was grim. "We woke it up." The prison was no longer just a prison. It was alive. Cells yawned open like mouths. The floor cracked, revealing endless black beneath. The walls breathed. The guards were gone. Or maybe they had never been real. The other inmates screamed. Shadows pulled them into the dark. Jacob turned to Mason. "How do we stop this?" Mason exhaled. "We don't." The prison groaned. And then the ceiling split open. Something huge, something ancient began to rise. Jacob watched in horror as the ceiling peeled open, revealing a swirling abyss where the night sky should have been. The thing rising from the darkness was impossible. Its form shifted, limbs growing and retracting, mouths opening and closing across its writhing flesh. Its voice was a chorus of whispers, all speaking at once. "We are Blackwood. We are hunger." Mason grabbed Jacob's arm. "We have to move. Now." The prison shook, walls cracking as the thing pulled itself free. Jacob ran. The corridors were a nightmare. Inmates screamed as shadows consumed them, their bodies melting into the walls. The prison was devouring them. Jacob and Mason ran toward the front gates. They were wide open. Freedom. Then, a wall of flesh slammed down in front of them. The prison wasn't letting them go. Jacob spun around. The guards stood in formation, eyes black, faces blank. They had never been human. The warden stepped forward, his grin too wide. "You belong to Blackwood now." Jacob's mind raced. There had to be a way out. Mason whispered, "The tunnels." If we collapse them, Jacob nodded. They had one chance. They ran back toward the basement as the prison roared, its walls closing in. The thing from the pit slithered after them, its many mouths whispering, screaming, laughing. Mason yanked a rusted gas pipe from the wall. "This'll do." Jacob grabbed a lighter from a fallen guard. The prison screamed, realizing what they were about to do. Jacob flicked the lighter. Burn in hell. The explosion ripped through the tunnels, fire racing through the prison's veins. The walls collapsed, crushing the thing inside. Jacob and Mason ran as Blackwood caved in, the abyss above swallowing itself. Then, silence. They were outside. Jacob gasped for air. Mason lay beside him, coughing. Blackwood was gone, or so they thought. A week later, Jacob sat in a cheap motel, staring at the news. Mysterious prison collapse. No survivors found. His blood went cold. Mason had been with him. Hadn't he? Then, a whisper. "It sees you." Jacob turned. His motel room door was open, and something was waiting in the dark.